I was sitting in the back row of courtroom 4B, just another quiet observer in what was supposed to be a quick misdemeanor hearing. The man they brought in wore a plain gray hoodie and faded jeans. His hands were cuffed. He had no lawyer beside him, at least not yet. 2 deputies walked him in like he was a convicted felon, grinning and whispering under their breath. I couldn't hear everything, but one line stuck with me, "Must have lost a bet with life," one of the officers chuckled. The courtroom wasn't full, mostly just some clerks, the judge, a public defender waiting for the next case, and me. I don't know why I stayed, something about the scene felt off. The man didn't look confused or panicked. He looked calm. Calm in a way that didn't match the cheap clothes or the smirks thrown at him by the officers. Judge Kramer barely looked up when she said, "Name?" The man tilted his head slightly and replied, "James Teller." That's when it started getting weird. The clerk typing his name suddenly paused. Looked up. Then typed again. Her eyes narrowed like she thought something was wrong in the system. Meanwhile, the 2 deputies behind him kept grinning. One leaned down and muttered loud enough for me to hear, "Maybe he thinks he's Jason Bourne." The man didn't react. Judge Kramer asked for the charge, loitering near a government facility, failure to produce ID. The officers stood taller, as if proud of themselves. The clerk cleared her throat. "Your Honor, we may have an issue here." Kramer looked irritated. "What kind of issue?" And then she read the screen herself. Her face changed. She leaned back slowly in her chair and blinked, twice. I looked around. Everyone else was still relaxed. But the judge wasn't. Because James Teller wasn't just any man in a hoodie. He was Director James Teller, head of the FBI. And nobody in that room had figured it out, until now. For a moment, no one moved. The courtroom was dead quiet, except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Judge Kramer slowly lifted her eyes from the screen and looked directly at the man in cuffs. "Sir, may I confirm, are you Director James Teller of the Federal Bureau of Investigation?" The man nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." The oxygen left the room. The 2 deputies who had been grinning seconds ago were now statues. One of them, Officer Deeks, visibly swallowed. The other shifted his feet and tried to look anywhere but at Teller. The judge's voice came down an octave. "Why were you brought in here?" "I was walking near a secure facility, off-duty. Your deputies asked for ID, which I provided verbally. They didn't believe me." Teller's tone was measured, professional. Not arrogant, just in control. You could tell he was the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice to make a point. Officer Deeks stepped forward quickly. "Your Honor, with respect, we had reason to believe he was casing the building. He wouldn't give us proper ID at first. I gave you my bureau ID number," Teller interrupted, still calm. "You laughed and said, 'Nice try, Mr. Secret Agent.' Then you cuffed me and threw me in the back of your cruiser." The judge turned a slow, sharp look at both deputies. "Did he say who he was?" Officer Deeks hesitated. "Yes. But, people lie all the time. And when he gave you a government ID number? We assumed it was fake." The judge turned back to Teller. "Do you have your badge?" He nodded again and slowly pulled a small, flat wallet from his waistband, previously hidden under his hoodie. He opened it and held it up for the judge to see. The gold shield gleamed. FBI. Real. And very, very official. The judge's face hardened. "Remove his cuffs." Immediately. Officer Deeks looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Teller didn't flinch. Didn't gloat. He just watched. Quiet. Controlled. But the temperature in that room had dropped 10 degrees, and it wasn't from the air conditioning. The sound of the handcuffs snapping open echoed like gunshots in the silent courtroom. Director Teller rolled his wrists slowly as the cuffs came off, as if measuring the moment, not with anger, but with precision. The two officers stepped back like they'd just realized they'd been standing too close to a live wire. Judge Kramer leaned forward, her voice icy now. "Director Teller, I sincerely apologize for what just occurred in this courtroom." "No need," he said coolly. "But I do want it noted on the record." She nodded immediately. "Clerk, mark the record, Mr. Teller was misidentified, improperly detained, and brought to court under false charges." Officer Deeks suddenly cleared his throat, trying to salvage his crumbling position. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the ID wasn't shown until now." "We didn't know, you didn't ask," Teller said, turning slightly to face him. "You heard a name and made a joke. You saw clothes and made an assumption. That's not protocol. That's ego." Even the stenographer had stopped typing. The second deputy, Officer Gant, finally spoke up, voice lower. "Sir, we thought maybe you were a threat." Teller tilted his head. "Then maybe you need retraining on how to identify an actual threat." The judge held up a hand. "That will be enough. Both deputies, remain in the courtroom. Bailiff, notify Internal Affairs to report here immediately following this hearing." Both men stiffened. Teller looked at the judge. "With your permission, I'll remain seated. I want to observe how this process continues." Judge Kramer hesitated, then nodded. "As you wish, Director." And just like that, the defendant became the most powerful person in the room. The officers didn't speak again. Because whatever mockery they had started with, had now flipped into a moment that might follow them for the rest of their careers. And Teller? He just leaned back in his seat and crossed his arms. As if he'd seen this kind of mistake before. The courtroom doors opened 15 minutes later. Two men and a woman in dark suits entered, badges clipped to their belts, eyes scanning the room like they already knew what they were walking into. Internal Affairs. Judge Kramer motioned to the bailiff, who stepped forward and handed the lead investigator a printed briefing. The agents reviewed it silently for a few seconds before turning their attention to Officers Deeks and Gant. "Step forward," the lead agent said. Neither of them moved at first. But under the judge's expectant stare, they finally walked to the front, shoulders straighter now, but their faces pale. "What were your grounds for detaining Mr. Teller?" the agent asked. Deeks spoke first. "He was loitering in a restricted zone. He gave a verbal ID, but it didn't seem credible." The female agent raised an eyebrow. "Did you run the number?" "No. We assumed it was a made-up code." "Assumed," the agent repeated. "Based on what?" Deeks looked cornered. It just didn't seem right. He didn't look the part. The room went still again. Director Teller didn't move. He didn't need to. The silence around him did all the speaking. Gant cleared his throat, trying to share the blame. "It was a fast call. We didn't want to risk it being real and ignoring it, but you did risk it being real," the agent snapped. "And you cuffed the director of the FBI without checking credentials. You're supposed to verify first, escalate second." Judge Kramer finally spoke up. "Both officers will be placed on administrative review effective immediately. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel fell. But no one stood up yet. Because all eyes were still on Teller, who finally rose from his chair, slow and steady, like gravity didn't affect him the same way it did everyone else. He nodded once at the judge, then turned and faced the two deputies one last time. "I'm not here to ruin careers," he said quietly. "But I am here to remind you that the people you overlook might outrank you in ways you can't imagine." Then he walked past them. No security. No entourage. Just calm authority that didn't need to announce itself. And the two officers? They didn't say another word. By the time Director Teller stepped outside the courthouse, the sky had shifted, blue-gray clouds forming overhead, as if even the weather knew something serious had gone down inside. I followed a few paces behind, stunned by everything I just witnessed. The man who had been laughed at and handcuffed less than an hour ago was now surrounded by silence and caution. Not fear, just deep, overdue respect. As he reached the parking lot, a black SUV pulled up. It had no sirens or markings, but you could tell by the subtle government plates that it wasn't just anyone driving. Teller opened the door, then paused. He turned back to the entrance of the courthouse, just for a moment. And I swear, he smiled. Just a flicker. Not smug. Not angry. Just a man who'd seen the justice system from both sides, and decided not to let his power turn into vengeance. Back inside, the fallout had already begun. Officer Deeks and Officer Gant were escorted to a private conference room, where internal affairs began their full investigation. Word would spread fast, within the department, across precincts, and eventually up the chain. And while no one was officially punished that day, everyone knew careers had just been redefined. Judge Kramer, for her part, issued a formal letter of apology, which later leaked to the press. It was full of phrases like, failure to properly identify, protocol violation, and institutional review. But what struck me most wasn't the bureaucracy. It was the way power had walked into that courtroom quietly, endured humiliation, and never once raised its voice. Because true authority doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be recognized, eventually. And that day, every smirk, every joke, and every assumption collapsed under the weight of one undeniable truth: they didn't mock a man. They mocked the director of the FBI. And they'll never forget it. 3 days after the courtroom incident, an internal memo circulated through law enforcement networks nationwide. It wasn't public, but somehow, it made its way onto every bulletin board, inbox, and locker room wall across dozens of agencies. The sender? Director James Teller. The subject line was simple: professionalism is not optional. The message read, on July 1st, I was detained by 2 officers who failed to verify my identity before making assumptions based on appearance. They didn't recognize me, and that's fine. What's not fine is forgetting that every person deserves professionalism and due process, regardless of status. I'm not writing this to punish. I'm writing it to remind. Respect doesn't start after you see a badge. It starts before. Train better. Assume less. Lead with integrity. One day, you might be the one sitting in the defendant's chair, and the people laughing might not know who you are either. It wasn't long. But it hit hard. Officers, agents, and staff across departments began holding quiet meetings, revisiting procedures, reviewing training manuals. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. Because the truth had landed like a gavel strike, it could have been anyone. And the man they laughed at? He chose not to bury them, but to teach them. And that lesson would echo long after the courtroom doors closed. A week later, the media caught wind. Not from a press release, not from a whistleblower, but from a blurry cell phone photo snapped by a court clerk. It showed Director James Teller sitting calmly in courtroom 4B, hands cuffed, with 2 officers standing behind him. No headline was needed. The image spoke for itself. But that didn't stop the headlines from exploding. FBI director mistakenly arrested, teaches silent lesson in power, deputies mock defendant, discover he runs the bureau, courtroom stunner, man laughed at by cops turns out to be top federal official, social media did what it always does, blew it up in 24 hours. Comments poured in. Some people demanded the officers be fired. Others praised Teller's restraint and composure. One comment went viral: he didn't need to flex power. He was power. And they didn't see it coming. Meanwhile, officers Deeks and Gant were quietly reassigned pending a full evaluation. They weren't fired, but the message was clear: next time, your assumptions could cost more than just embarrassment. They could cost trust, reputation, and lives. The courthouse where it all happened became a symbol, briefly, for how easily judgment can cloud justice, and how quickly arrogance can turn to regret. But for James Teller, it wasn't about headlines. He never made a statement to the press. Never gave an interview. He just returned to work, quietly, deliberately, and let the silence of his professionalism echo louder than any accusation. Because he knew what they didn't, the most dangerous man in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove it. 2 weeks after the incident, the courthouse had mostly returned to normal, at least on the surface. But something had changed. Officers stood a little straighter. Court clerks double-checked ID logs. The whispers had quieted, replaced with a kind of respectful alertness. No one wanted to be the next headline. Then, quietly and without cameras, Director James Teller returned. This time, he wasn't in jeans or a hoodie. He wore a sharp navy suit. No entourage. No badge visible. Just him, and a single folder under his arm. He walked directly to Judge Kramer's chambers and knocked once. Inside, the judge stood as he entered. "Director Teller," she said, clearly surprised. "I wasn't expecting, I won't take much of your time," he interrupted, calm as ever. "I wanted to personally deliver this." He set the folder on her desk. Inside was a detailed review of officer conduct and courthouse procedures, along with a voluntary training module designed by the Bureau, focused on bias, identification, and restraint under pressure. "I'd like your team to be the first in the state to test it," he said. Judge Kramer looked at the folder, then up at him. "You're offering help, after what happened here." He smiled faintly. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for improvement." She nodded slowly. "You could have embarrassed a lot of people." "I still could," he said plainly. Then added, "But that's not how you fix systems. You fix them from the inside, before they break again." With that, he turned and walked out. No press. No post. No performance. Just a man who'd been mocked, detained, and underestimated, and who still chose restraint over revenge. And long after he left, his presence lingered. Not because he demanded fear. But because he earned something far rarer in that courtroom, respect. In Courtroom 4B, there's a chair, third row from the front, aisle seat, that no one seems to sit in anymore. It's not reserved. There's no plaque. No sign. But the regulars, clerks, officers, even attorneys, glance at it from time to time, as if expecting someone to sit there again. Someone quiet. Someone who doesn't need to say much to change everything. That's the seat James Teller occupied when he returned weeks after the incident, dressed in full suit, just observing. He came twice more, quietly, without announcement. Never spoke. Never intervened. But everyone noticed. The deputies who once laughed. They never laughed again, not in court, not in uniform. They completed the FBI's training program. They stayed on the force. Humbled. Changed. Judge Kramer later shared, privately, that she'd received a handwritten note from Teller weeks after his final visit. It read, "Justice isn't a podium or a gavel. It's the quiet choice to do better when no one's watching. I saw this court at its worst. I returned because I believe it can be its best. JT." The note was never published. But the message outlasted any news cycle. And that chair? It sits empty. Out of respect. Because sometimes, the person who leaves the biggest impression is the one who walked in alone, laughed at by everyone, and walked out having taught them all a lesson they'll never forget. Months passed. The courtroom no longer buzzed with gossip about the FBI director incident. New cases rolled in. Faces changed. But beneath the surface, everyone who'd been there that day remembered. Not just because of who James Teller was. But because of how he handled it. He never sued. Never demanded suspensions. Never used his position to humiliate anyone. He let the facts speak, let professionalism win. That unnerved people more than any outburst ever could. Eventually, a new class of cadets toured the courthouse during training week. One of the instructors, a grizzled, seasoned officer, pointed at that now famous chair. He didn't say much. Just, "You see that seat? That's where a man sat who could have ended careers." But instead, he changed them. The cadets listened closely. It wasn't just a story about law enforcement anymore. It had become a case study, shared at leadership seminars, criminal justice conferences, and FBI onboarding. How assumptions can cost you, the slides read. How silence can be louder than outrage. And in the end, James Teller never had to speak again about what happened. Because the courtroom, the officers, the town, they all did the talking for him. And whenever his name came up, people didn't talk about what was said. They talked about what wasn't. Because sometimes, power isn't shown in what you do, but in what you choose not to. Years later, the story of what happened in Courtroom 4B would become a quiet legend, retold in training rooms, whispered in briefings, even adapted into internal role-play exercises for law enforcement. But what people remembered most wasn't the headline. It wasn't even that James Teller was the FBI director. It was that, in the face of mockery, presumption, and humiliation, he chose discipline. It was that none of the people who mocked him ever saw anger in his eyes, only a calm so complete it made them uncomfortable. Teller retired 5 years later, on his own terms. No press tour. No farewell interview. But his name was etched, unofficially, into the culture of the justice system. Whenever a courtroom got too casual. Whenever an officer cracked a smug joke during intake. Whenever someone was about to make a snap judgment based on appearance, someone always brought up the same story. "Don't be the guy who cuffed Teller." It became a phrase. A warning. A standard. And that courtroom seat? Still empty. Still respected. Because some chairs don't need a plaque to be sacred. They carry the memory of the person who sat there, the kind of person who didn't need noise, threats, or applause to change a room. Just presence. Just principle. Just the unshakable calm of a man who reminded the entire system what justice is supposed to look like.